Buongiorno, Mondo, and welcome back to 15 with Fosca, the podcast. I am so happy to be here today with Chloe Edmondson. Ciao, Chloe.
Ciao, Vostra. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm delighted. And it's funny because I think that some people might find it odd that I've invited you, and that you are a member of the faculty, the French department at Stanford University, right? And you might ask, like, well, what were you thinking? Why would you ask Chloe, who is a French expert, a Francophile? Why would you invite her to talk at your podcast, which is all about Italy? But actually, there is a reason. And it's because you studied abroad in Florence while you were an undergraduate at Stanford. And I want to talk about that. I want to start with that because I want to know how your time here in Italy impacted you. And I'd like to know how it impacted you professionally. And you can just tell us a bit about what you're doing right now. And also on a personal level, how your time in Florence sort of shaped the person that you are today.
Absolutely. And that is one of my favorite things to talk about is my time studying abroad in Florence. I think most people who have had that study abroad experience find themselves still talking about it years, even over a decade later. And so I think in some ways, the fact that I have always been a Francophile and now that is my profession
Right.
is largely why I wanted to study abroad in Italy. So as long as I can remember as a child, I had this idea that I wanted to study in Italy. And I don't really know where that came from. We can ponder why that might be. Perhaps
Okay.
it's because the Lizzie McGuire movie came out when I was little. Perhaps, but I do think there's one aspect is Italy, I think, was the first country I went to as a child where I did not
Mm.
speak the language. And
Ah,
I think that had a really big impact on me because I was really excited to be in that different environment, to learn phrases. I learned how to order my own gelato in Italian at the age of 8 or 9. I can't remember. And I think that I just was left with this desire to learn more. And so growing up, I did grow up bilingual in French, and I had family connections and friends in France. We spent time there. And so for me, as long as I can remember, I had this idea that I really wanted to have what I considered to be an authentic study abroad experience. So I wanted to study abroad in a place where I was not fluent in the language
okay.
and where I was not familiar with the culture. And so I always had this plan of freshman year, fall quarter, I was going to enroll in Italian 1 and study abroad. So I think that that is kind of the backstory of where that desire to study abroad in Italy came from. And we can certainly talk more about those personal
Yeah.
reasons. I think professionally, there there isn't a super obvious answer. And of course, when I was 19, I wasn't thinking that far ahead. But I
Yeah.
think that there are a lot of reasons that now in retrospect make sense. So when you do a PhD in a foreign language and literature department, there is typically a requirement that you have a third language. So naturally, I used Italian. I took some advanced Italian language classes. I sat for a very lengthy exam to show
Mhm.
my proficiency.
Right.
And a lot of departments in the US are actually departments of French and Italian. That is very common. So a lot of my coursework was cross-listed in both departments, and we studied Italian authors and French authors. Of course, intellectually, there's also a lot of really important and interesting crossovers. So when I teach the French Renaissance, of course, I draw on my knowledge of the Italian Renaissance and the impact of canonical texts like Dante's Divina Commedia, Boccaccio's Decameron,
Right.
Petrarch's love sonnets. And so, of course, there are some intellectual resonances. And so I
Yeah.
think that in that way, there is this coherence between where my past has taken me and what I'm doing today. And I think certainly also that experience of studying in Italy and learning the language has also enabled me to really connect with my colleagues in Italian studies, and colleagues who are from Italy. And so that's also been really valuable as well.
That's really nice to hear. And I don't think I knew that that was the reason why you had chosen Florence. And I don't know if I had remembered that you had grown up bilingual. And I love what you remember, that childhood, that beautiful childhood memory of seeing the challenge and the power, right, in a foreign language. And I wonder the way that stands out for you as this sort of really significant childhood memory. Do you have something that stands out from your time in Florence as an undergraduate? I mean, when you think about that time, what are the authentic experience you had, because you did have a really authentic experience in the end. So what do you remember? What do you recall with, fondness? Because it was this time of year as well. Am I right?
Yes,
When you
you're
first
right. It
arrived.
was winter quarter. I had just arrived in early
Right.
January. I mean,
Too.
you
This
know,
is week two.
I
So this
think
would have been week
frankly,
two.
I think I remember everything with fondness. I think, it's actually interesting. So when I initially planned to study abroad, I planned to study abroad as a sophomore because I thought it would make sense to break up when I went abroad for Florence and when I was also going to go abroad for Paris.
Right.
And because you have to apply so early, I applied in, maybe mid-year of my freshman year, and I actually got cold feet. And so I drafted the application and I did not send it in because I thought it felt too soon to leave
Yeah.
campus.
Right.
And so I didn't send it in, but I had the application fully completed. And then in August, right before my sophomore year started, I remember receiving an email where the Florence winter quarter had open spots. And so I applied on the spot. I had the application fully completed
Right.
and was accepted. And I think that's probably the best and spontaneous decision I've ever made. And I think there's so much I remember with fondness. I think every day, frankly. But I think something that really stood out was actually during orientation.
Hmm.
And I remember that you had some quote about inviting us to be travelers, not tourists. And you really kind of encouraged us to avoid the urge to travel to a different country every weekend and to really make Florence our home and
Right.
to develop a routine to really kind of get to know the city and make it our own. And I think I really took
Exactly.
that to heart. And I think that that is partly why I had such a memorable and authentic experience. I had my routine. My homestay was right next to Piazza San Marco. And I remember walking the 20 or 25-minute walk every day to the Florence
Mhm.
Center, through the city, through Piazza della Repubblica,
Mhm.
across the Ponte Vecchio. And I would have my routine. I would stop in my coffee shops, and I had one that I
Right.
went to most days. And on the day that that was closed, I had my other coffee shop.
Exactly.
And I would pop into stores, usually on my way home from school, not on the way
Mhm.
to school.
Mhm.
And I loved that. I went to museums every week, if not once a week, more than once a week. And of course, the food, and also the friendships that were formed there.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought up so many great things, and I think that's something that we worked really hard at the program, and of course that they're still working hard at. And you cited what our director, what Professor Campani would always say, which is, to be travelers, not tourists. And then also what something that I would always encourage the students to do, which was just to go out there and explore and have your favorite places and get into a routine and get to know the locals, even in those just really spontaneous encounters. And I love the fact that you recall that with you recognize now, maybe at the time, yes, you kind of understood it, but now when you think about it, you're like, wait, that was amazing. Like, I think the privilege of being able to go to museums, especially, um, and to be able to be in such a small space with such a high concentration of incredibly compelling things to see and do is such it's mind-blowing if you actually stop and think about it. Just how amazing that is, that access, to so much beauty.
Definitely. And I think that something that also, of course, I remember with so much fondness is the fact that, and this is not just unique to the Florence program, I think study abroad in general, is oftentimes professors use the city as the classroom. And so,
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
would go to museums for class, and that was our classroom. We would visit villas in the countryside and
Yeah.
see their private art collections. And that was just such a unique experience because when else in your undergraduate education will you be able to do that?
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
think also another aspect that really stands out, which you were talking about, how I arrived here, exactly over a decade ago this time of year. I
Right.
remember that one of the first experiences that the program created for us was we were taken to the Castello di Verrazzano in Chianti, and we had
Right.
this tour of the winery and this
Yeah.
nice Italian lunch, and we were
Yeah,
taught the proper way to taste wine. And
that's great.
I actually think about this every time I'm at a restaurant, and if I'm the person tasting the wine, when I swirl the glass of wine, I am transported back to that experience. Which so I, it's something I think about it all the time, and I think that that's something that my friends and I from the program often joke about is just how often we still talk about those Florence memories, even though it was so long ago.
Yeah, I think those are those. You also had a very special group. I think it was a very tight group, and those kind of affinities always, really enhance the experience. You also had authentic experiences because coming this time of year is not like coming in the fall or in the spring. Stanford has a quarter system, and I I want to get back to this childhood epiphany with the language learning, which I find fascinating, because being bilingual, raising my child bilingual, also watching her now that she's studying other languages, it's just fascinating the way our brains work, right? And um, I want to know how you talk to the students today about, well, you're a young faculty member. So I imagine the students feel connected to you and feel comfortable sort of talking to you. And I imagine you talk about your experiences studying abroad, both in Florence and in Paris. But I wonder, like, how do you reach the students today teaching the humanities, teaching them the importance of a foreign language? And I don't know, do you encourage them to go abroad? Do you tell them about your experiences and how they have been so fundamentally, life-changing for you?
Definitely. And I think that something that I've noticed with my students is that it doesn't take a lot of convincing. They all want to study abroad. So I
Oh,
think that
yeah.
that desire is there. I think that where sometimes students don't know if they have the room in their schedules to do it,
Yeah.
or they don't know if they can justify taking that time off of their major. And so that's where there might be a little convincing that's necessary. But I will say that often, of course, I talk about my experiences, but oftentimes because I am teaching classes in the French department, I have students that often have just returned from abroad. And so they're the ones that are singing their praises. And
Yeah.
anytime a student raises the prospect of, I'm thinking of studying abroad, the students are the ones that are telling them, you absolutely have to go. It is
That's
the best
great.
time of your life. And so, of course, I echo that. But I think something I know that something that you are interested in is also this importance of the language learning. And so I think
Exactly.
that I think this is obviously a huge topic today. There's a lot of universities that are shutting down language departments. A lot of universities are also getting rid of the requirements. And a lot of programs no longer require the language as a prerequisite to study abroad. And I know that there are a lot of pros and cons on both sides.
Yeah.
But I personally believe that this is so important to study. If you're going to study abroad, you need to really invest the time in learning the language, because I
Yeah.
think that it changes your experience immeasurably. Not, I think that the richness that you gain of living in a foreign country really comes from those daily interactions with locals, with your host family. I had the most wonderful host family, and with your neighborhood
Yeah.
cafe and the neighbors. And I think especially in a country like Italy, where Italians are so welcoming and
Yeah.
so forgiving with the language,
Exactly.
and they
Exactly.
want to speak with you, and they're so thrilled when you make an effort to try. And I
Absolutely.
really think that a huge part of that experience comes from speaking the language, because there's so many concepts culturally that there are no direct translations for. There are
Exactly.
mannerisms, and I really just think it adds this whole other dimension. And really, even if it's not required, I think that if you have enough interest in a country to take an entire term of your undergraduate education to study there, I think it's worth taking that extra class, even if you take it pass not pass, to learn the language a little bit before you go, because I do
Yeah.
think that you're only at the end of the day hindering your own experience if you go abroad with no knowledge of the language. I think it's a bit like the cliche of Emily in Paris in season one. And that's, you don't want to be Emily in Paris
No,
season
you
one,
don't. No.
no experience of the language. And I think, something that's really interesting when you mentioned that you are raising your daughter bilingual, and you obviously are bilingual yourself, is I'm sure you agree that, you know, I think when you speak multiple languages, you also kind of adopt the personality, the
Oh,
mannerisms, the culture
yeah.
of that language. And so I think
Absolutely.
adds so many dimensions to your personality.
Absolutely. Wow, you've touched on so many amazing points. I wouldn't even know, I don't even know where to start, but I do agree 100%. And you put it in a way I think that is really so it's just so spot on, which is like, we're in control of our experiences, ultimately we're the ones who determine, our what our paths are going to be and how those are going to, how things are going to play out in our lives up to a certain point, of course. So saying, I think, having a linguistic preparation, even a minimal amount, even a quarter under your belt or a semester or whatever, just at least having gotten some taste of, of the language really does transform your experience. And there are so many, so many things going on in higher education right now. Really so many hot topics. And I wonder, like one of them, it's sort of a perennial one is the humanities, right? And the value of the humanities. And this is something and that I really, really am interested in hearing about from you today, because you're teaching the humanities to this generation. And I see this as a time where the humanities are more important than ever. Studying the humanities is just more important than ever. But how do you um, convey that to students who might feel pressured, for example, to major in something more practical or that will give them greater prospects of higher salaries upon graduation? I mean, that's just normal. I think for like 99% of college students today, it's a huge shift from, for example, when I was studying, where that wasn't really. It existed, but not in the kind of. Today things are just so fast. So how, the humanities is also really about slowing down, right? It's about close readings. It's about focusing. It's about the text, the word, the image. So it's, how do you do that, Chloe? How do you teach today? How do you teach the humanities today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something I want to address first before I talk about my approach is I think this question of first kind of this direct relevance, right? So
Yeah.
is there professional relevance or a benefit that you get from studying the humanities or even studying abroad? And I think that, first I just want to say that I think, the tools that you gain through studying the humanities are going to serve you in any career that you have. It's the ability to write and express clearly, to communicate clearly, to solve problems that have no clear answers, to collaborate with others, and to think critically. And I think that even studying abroad, I think, you asked how that impacted me professionally. And I think that, just the skills that it takes and the tools that you gain that are required to have a positive study abroad experience are tools that will serve you in any career that you have. So even the confidence that it takes to speak a foreign
Absolutely.
language at the grocery store, in a cafe, in a classroom, I think that in and of itself that is something that's going to serve you when you go back to presenting and communicating in your mother tongue, and the resourcefulness that it takes to solve even a basic daily problem in a foreign country and in a foreign language is already a mini lesson in problem solving, in resourcefulness, in taking initiative and taking risks. So I think all of those are inherently very valuable and will serve you in whatever career you choose. I
Absolutely.
also think that it's a misconception that, even if we are in a global world, obviously not everybody speaks English. And if you look at lots of job postings, so many jobs have knowing a foreign language as a plus. And so I think that again is something, and I know from personal experience, many of my friends who did not pursue the humanities after their undergraduate education, many of them have leveraged those skills in business, in education, in philanthropy, in law and government work, and the list really goes on.
Yeah.
In terms of, the value of the humanities today, and I completely agree that they are more important than ever. I think for one, and this might be purely anecdotal, but it seems to
Okay.
me today that there is perhaps more than ever a lack of historical awareness of where we have been in the past as a society. And I think that we really seem to be dominated by this overwhelming preoccupation with the present in this digital age. And there's a sense that there's so many problems we're dealing with that are new. And I think for students, it's really critical that they gain that historical worldview to better grasp that the problems today are not created in a vacuum. And we can both learn from the mistakes of the past as well as the solutions of the past and look at how societies at different historical moments have confronted similar issues. And so, for instance, a text that I teach all the time is Voltaire's philosophical tale Candide, which tells the story of a young boy who travels the world and is confronted with one horror after another: war, natural disasters, violence, religious intolerance. And I think that this is perhaps more relevant than ever when we think about
Right.
the catalog of difficulties that we are
Right.
facing today as a world. And Candide, with its message of cultivating one's garden, provides a modest response philosophically of how to live life in the face of adversity that's outside of one's control. And so I think that and I think the list goes on of the lessons we can take
Absolutely.
from the humanities. Also, when we think about technology and the impact of technology in society, I think that a lot of philosophy and literature and history helps us think through some of those ethical issues. And so my approach in the classroom, I think, is really twofold. I think as a historian, my favorite thing about teaching is really bringing distant societies to life for my students and helping them to understand how people in different cultures and at different periods of time experienced life differently. How did somebody experience love in Renaissance France? What was it like to be a woman in 18th century France? And then at the same time, I also really encourage my students to draw connections between the past and the present. So to really think about, where do our ideas today about society, about what makes life meaningful, about love, about politics, about human rights, where do those ideas that we cherish today come from? And what did they look like in the past? And how are ideas today still really formed and shaped by how things were conceived in the past? And really that kind of intellectual heritage.
Absolutely. And I think that, well, first of all, you've made an amazing case for the humanities here. And so I hope that this message reaches a lot of people. I do think we're grappling with so many things right now. And that's, obviously what I was getting at when I said, now is really, it is more important than ever that we do look back. And, because we're not learning. And you talked about being very, the students being very present focused. And I would also ask you if you think that maybe we're all a little too future obsessed as well. I think the velocity, of today's society, and, all of the sort of doomsday messages that we're getting constantly, right? Um, I mean, I find myself thinking a heck of a lot more about the future than I had maybe even 10 years ago. And I don't think it's just aging, because I think that young people really do feel the burden of the future and what they've inherited. It's now, this is the present. They know very well what they've inherited. So I think that something that I always really, I don't know, kind of, when I would talk to the students about what I think their responsibility was, and is in the world, is that they really do use the Florence experience, right? So the humanness of that experience, right? And everything that you touched upon, all of the gifts that it gives you, right? In terms of what then you bring out to the world, but to do it so that you really can change the world. So, giving them that, really the notion that they needed to focus in on what the experience really meant, to then, be able to really benefit and then go out and affect change. I think it's it's not an easy message to convey in today's world, but you make, as I said, such a good case for it, because we need to be talking about these things like in a different way. We need to be, um, sitting down and talking about these ethical questions in a way that, as you said, those who study the humanities, have this sort of this lexicon, right? And this approach and this way to look at things, which is extremely helpful right now because there aren't that many things that we can, you know, it feels, I think, very slippery right now. Everything feels tenuous, So I want to focus on, I want to shift gears really a little. And it's very evident that you're passionate about your teaching and your research. And so I would like for you to talk about both of those. I want to hear a little bit about what you teach, what you love to teach, and also what your research, I know your research interests are varied and many. So I will let you talk about sort of what you're doing now, what your big projects are, and just sort of, the joys of your daily life as an academic.
Yeah, absolutely. So to talk about my teaching a bit first. So in generally speaking, I teach two classes in the core series for the undergraduate major and minor. So in the fall, I was teaching the survey course on medieval and Renaissance literature. And now I'm teaching the survey on 17th and 18th century literature. So we look
Okay.
at Lutism, Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. And I think these classes are really fun and a joy to teach because
Yeah.
we go over so many kind of important literary movements, historical movements, political change, and students get a really solid grasp of how literary genre has evolved over time. And what's interesting is because a lot of these they are required to take some of the early modern classes, oftentimes they kind of approach the class thinking it's going to be boring and they have to
Right.
take. But by the end of the class, they typically are finding that it's the most fun class they have all quarter. And they're really surprised to see how relatable French Renaissance love poetry is, or how relatable an 18th century novel is.
Right.
And that's really exciting and rewarding to see that. And probably my favorite class that I teach is a class that I've been teaching since winter 2022. So I've taught it 3 times now. And I was given a carte blanche to create whatever class I wanted. And so
Oh,
the class,
nice.
yeah, it was very exciting. And the class is called French Kiss, The History of Love and the French Novel.
That's a that's just, chapeau. I mean, that's a beautiful title. I love titles. I would have loved to have taken your class, Chloe.
Thank you. And it's been such a joy to teach because every time I've taught it, the class has gotten larger and larger, and students are so engaged with the material and with one another. And so some of the core questions that we think about are how did individuals experience love throughout history? We move from the 17th century all the way up to the 1980s.
Mhm.
We look at how novels reflect this evolution over time. And most importantly, we think about how French novels have shaped our own understanding of and expectations for romantic love today. So we look at seduction and passion and desire and this conflict between society and love and duty and love. And I also pair some of the texts with contemporary movies to kind of think about this enduring relevance of love à la française or French
Uh-huh.
love.
That's what a brilliant, what a great class. And how can the students not respond to something like that?
Oh, they absolutely
They
do.
must love it. I mean, it's just, it sounds like such a fun class. And it's great because while you were talking, I was like, oh, I wonder if Chloe uses films because I thought, obviously that's sort of an obvious, like a good connection. I don't know. It's thrilling. And I think I wanted to, before we talk about your research, I wanted to go back to something you said a little bit earlier that I felt so I really liked because when you were talking about your teaching and you talked about making these people and these moments in history come to life for your students, right? So you're telling stories, right? You're urging them to look back to the past, but it's so relevant, right? So you were just saying about French love, right? It's eternal. There are always lessons there, right? And so it's the same thing with Voltaire and with the historical text, but with the great philosophers, with the great thinkers. I know the Enlightenment is one of your is your specialties as well. And so the students really need things that are relatable, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about this because wow, yes, this is all stuff that we can still understand love through this, this seemingly antiquated, text or whatever, but no, and I find that so exciting. And, so the fact that you've made that the humanities become so relevant to sort of the human experience, but to every woman, every man, it's the, sort of the great equalizer, if you will, right?
And something that really surprises a lot of my colleagues is each time I've taught this class is they expect the class to be primarily female students, but every time it's been 50-50. And I
I
think
love it.
it's been so much fun to teach and probably one of my most rewarding teaching experiences because in the evals, students consistently report it's their favorite class they've ever taken at Stanford. And they say it's one of the few classes where they've actually made friends and connected with one another.
Love
And
that.
they also, some of them have told me that it's been really cathartic if they're going through a breakup. And it's a topic and a class that's so relatable. And I think that any of my students will attest to the fact that I assign a lot of reading. I'm kind of known for that. I will assign the full book. We read, 8 to 10 novels a quarter in 10 short weeks, and they do the reading. And, even I assign Dangerous Liaisons, for instance, which is a
Oh,
400-page epistolary
yeah.
novel from the 18th century. And the students, you can tell based on the quality of the discussion, you can tell that they're all reading the entire text. And that's really been really exciting.
It's amazing. And, love is, it's universal and it's eternal, and so it's something that we all need to go, we often need to go back throughout our lives, right? We need to have those, I would even call them anchors, those things that we go back to. I don't know. It's sort of like, a comfort in those recountings of love, expressions of love, and they do help us through things like heartache and but also sort of the butterflies phase, right? So it's a beautiful thing because I think it's something that they'll carry with them throughout their lives because love is a part of all of our lives, right? And whether that, in all its forms. So it's a beautiful, I think it's a beautiful gift that you're giving them, to have this internal resource, if you will. And so they're looking at love. And it would be nice if, everyone had that, if we could all sort of slow down a bit and contemplate things and look back and, pause, just a little.
Absolutely. And I think for me as an educator, I think my measure of success is not necessarily if a student then goes on to study French literature, but really for me, the measure of success is did they get excited about an author or
Right.
a genre or a historical time period? And maybe they'll continue to cultivate that interest as a hobby. Maybe they'll read more Flaubert, or maybe they'll read, they'll take an art history class on French painting. And for me, that really is the measure of success. I just want to kind of ignite an excitement and a love of literature and different cultures and
Yeah.
language. And however they carry that with them throughout their lives, for me, that's what's exciting.
And it sounds like it's working. I mean, it sounds like you're definitely conveying what is true love for you. I mean, that's in and of itself, it's quite rare to find, such passion about your work and your teaching. And so I want to talk about your work because I heard you on a podcast. It's so funny because I'll tell a little because I like to talk. I mean, we know each other. We've known each other now for more than 10 years. We may as well just come clean. So I heard you on a podcast with professor of Italian at Stanford, Robert Harrison, who also is a friend and former colleague of my dad's. So somebody that I know sort of from life. And I don't remember if you had sent me the link or if I just found it. And no, I think you had sent it. And this was like way before having a podcast was even like on, it wasn't even a blip on my radar. I was at Stanford. Were we in the pandemic? Or
I
was it
think
before?
it was coming out of the pandemic. I want to say it
Wait,
was April 2022 or no, I guess April 2022, I think.
okay. I don't remember the timing, but I remember I was like, oh, because I've always loved podcasts. And so I listened to it and I thought, oh, this is such an interesting topic. And Chloe is really a good speaker on the podcast. And so I just remember being very impressed with your conversation. And I think I had written to you and I had said, oh, I loved the podcast. Your research sounds so interesting. And then we've always sort of just kept in touch. We follow each other on social media and things like that. And, but let's talk a little bit about your work, because I was intrigued by the topic of that particular conversation, but I know you're doing lots of things. So why don't you tell me a little bit about what's going on in terms of your research?
Certainly. So my research really combines cultural history, literary studies, and media theory to rethink our understanding of contemporary media issues from a historical perspective. So, what I look at specifically is letter writing practices in 17th and 18th century France, and looking at how social norms developed for presenting oneself in letters at this really crucial moment when the postal system went through massive innovations in the early 17th century. And so the letter really became an everyday medium of communication. So you might be thinking, what does this have to do with social media? What can we possibly learn from French aristocrats' letters about social media and identity? Because we tend to think of the link between social media and identity as a very 21st century and digital phenomenon in comparison to letter writing, or snail mail, as we might
Right.
call it, which we think of as very much one-to-one, private and personal communication. So that is really kind of the jumping off point for my project. And scholars have really identified this period of history as kind of the birth of our modern media revolution. And so much of this is thanks to evolutions in the postal system, of course, the printing press, and other media forms and technologies as well. And so if we look at letter writing practices, we find many parallels actually to behaviors on social media. And it's in this period that people really start to think about how they present themselves in letters as part of an everyday social concern, and to think about how people use the medium of the letter for their own strategic purposes to shape their image in society through what we might call today multi-platform production. So in other words, I looked at case studies where someone might write a seemingly personal letter, but with the knowledge, expectation, and intention that it could circulate more broadly. Because some common practices in this time period was that even personal letters that you might write to a relative or a friend would often be read aloud in group familial settings
Right.
and groups of friends. They might then circulate more broadly and get copied out. And if you were somebody who was well known, the letter might eventually get published without your consent, and really circulate to a broader public.
Fascinating. It's fascinating. It's like the way people, yeah, present themselves today on social media. So it's a beautiful study because it's so fascinating on like so many different levels. And so what are you doing in terms of that project? Is it a book? Is it it's a book.
So right now I am working on completing the book manuscript, which is a revision of my doctoral dissertation. And so that's kind of my number one priority right now. But I do think, I often have been thinking about the fact that I think this is a topic with a lot of general public appeal. And I could see
Absolutely.
eventually writing kind of a version of this book as a trade book, and kind of really broadening it out to think more about these resonances, looking at love letters as well, for instance, or looking at
I
how
was
people
thinking.
the letter for social activism, and looking at privacy and surveillance. So another kind of second project I also have is looking at the history of privacy and surveillance, and looking specifically at the surveillance of the postal system and reactions to this in the 18th century.
It's really fascinating because it does have all these other, as you were saying, just so many different points. What you've done is already so impressive, but the whole, if you think about it, I mean, the way we express ourselves, and the way we've expressed ourselves through time, I mean, it's fascinating. And there we go back to people's stories, right? And so letters, hearing people's voices, that's the way we, that's what you want to do, right? That's what you do, but that's also what we're doing right now. So the podcast is the most sort of one of the most contemporary forms of communication, but fundamentally, we're just reading letters aloud. You know what I mean? We're just presenting ourselves to the world. And so it's extremely relevant. Also, a very fascinating topic. And I love the privacy and surveillance research as well. It seems like you've got so many exciting things going on. So when are you coming back to Italy?
I hope sometime soon. I hope sometime soon. The last time I was in Italy was for a dear friend's wedding in 2022. And it was such a joy to be back because I hadn't been back I think at that point it had been a decade at least. And it was just overwhelming how happy it made me to be back in Italy.
I can imagine. I can imagine. You could easily, teach a class here. I mean, I would imagine, right? I mean, with Florence as your classroom, what have you thought about that? Have you dreamed about that? Is there a class that you would love to teach if you could like teach on site? You might also in Paris. I mean, just anywhere. We talked about it before, but sort of the privilege of having all those resources at your fingertips is very exciting for an academic. And when you're on the streets with your students or in the archives, for example, or touching some of those letters, right?
Definitely. And I think when you've asked about the daily joys of being an academic, I think those research periods abroad, being in the archives, touching the actual letters is definitely one of those great pleasures of being an academic. I think, I would be so excited to think about a class in Italy or Paris. I think that's something I've gotten such positive response from the students about French Kiss that I could see kind of developing an Italian version of that, or
Right.
and combining it with visits to museums, looking at the representation of love in art, perhaps the ballet, the opera. And another
Wonderful.
kind of side project that I've been developing, which is very, very new, but it's something that I'm excited about, is doing a study of the history of the Palais Royal in Paris and looking at how kind of this physical site kind of organized this whole culture, both, amorous, it's where the king had his mistresses, and then looking at the evolution of that over time. So at this point, I feel like I have a lot of different projects I'm excited about, and really it's just about having the time to work
Right.
on them. But I think something I'm really excited about too is really doing more work, bringing my research to a broader public. So through podcasts, through perhaps op-eds, and through books facing the public, because I think that it's really wonderful to be able to share these historical insights and stories with the public.
I agree so much. And I'm happy that as we're coming to the end, we're talking about um, letter writing, because it's something I think about quite a bit. And then I want to talk about the classes idea. Um, I think about it quite a bit because I grew up writing letters and receiving letters, and I go back to them often. I mean, often I stumble upon them and it's lovely, you know? Postcards, letters. I mean, I spent a lot of time abroad as well. And so looking at those old, faded, letters, it's beautiful to hold those in your hand. And I'm talking about things from like, maybe 30 years ago, not, 300. And so I think though that there's value, so much value in writing, expressing oneself in the written form, but also it's something that I take very seriously, like, and I always have, the importance of the written word. And so I love that you are trying to bring that to a greater public. And I do think that the French Kiss, um, both the class and potentially something else, could be extremely appealing to a greater public, because love, you see, is the one thing that, it's probably the only thing that really keeps us going most of the time, these days. And because it is sort of, equated with all sorts of other things like hope. And, we can talk about, all those other, things that seem to be missing right now, but love, right? Love is what sustains us. So, I love how you immediately had, just at the quick, you had already mapped out the Florence class, you had already mapped out the Paris class. And I love that because it shows also, if we want to go back to the beginning of the podcast, just how, you're multidisciplinary and you're interdisciplinary and multicultural and bilingual multilingual formation has, given just this seemingly really endless amount of really incredible things to share with the world. And I'm so happy that you're doing this work. And I love the Palais Royal project as well. And I think I had seen recently, or I had looked at your bio and I saw that you're working on another city project, another I just remember the images of like historical images of Paris. And so you're also working, is that related to the other research, like the postal media research, or?
It's not related to
Okay.
the book on letter writing practices, but something that I'm doing this year is I'm the France Stanford Center Fellow for the Roxane Debusson collection in special collections at the Stanford
Oh,
Library. And
wonderful.
so, in a nutshell, the library acquired this private collection on the history of Paris. It's this massive collection. And this year, as the fellow working on this collection, I am essentially working as a processing archivist, and I am getting the collection ready to be used by researchers, which at the same time,
Right.
of course, it's making me think of all sorts of ideas for future research. There's a lot on the Palais Royal, so that's also the connection there.
Yeah, because I was thinking, I remember seeing images and I wonder if there were some connections, and it's wonderful to hear that all of these, things come together, in these spaces, in archives, in libraries.
Yes, definitely.
The physical spaces. I mean, that we need to, that touching, again, going back to that, being able to look at those photographs, it must be incredibly exciting.
Definitely, absolutely. And I think that that's something interesting with, again, toggling between, the digital age and the past, is
Right.
that, there's often this question of, well, if everything's digitized, right? Because thankfully, a lot of these national libraries have digitized their collections, thankfully, because it enables us to do our research from home, which is
Absolutely.
necessary. But at the same time, it's still not a replacement for engaging with the physical material archive. And there are things that you can find and derive from a physical letter where you can tell if this is a draft of a letter, if it's a copy, if it was sent in the mail or not, based on
Mhm.
if it was folded, if it has
Right.
the remnants of the wax seal. And so there's all these aspects that are just irreplaceable, and the digital cannot replicate that.
I wanted you to talk a little more about that because I don't think a lot of people outside of like an academic realm really even have not like a basic notion. That sounds snobby, but like it might seem mysterious to people. So, Chloe, I know you also do a lot of work with the digital humanities. So, as we sort of come to a close, I like the idea of digital humanities because it sort of synthesizes our whole conversation, which is sort of, past, present, future, and so the humanities and the accessibility and importance of the humanities. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about the digital humanities?
Yes, that's a great question to conclude with. So, the digital humanities are a relatively new field that has been, pioneered by scholars all over the world. A lot of them, unsurprisingly, at Stanford, given
Exactly.
we are in Silicon Valley. And it's really a field that leverages new technologies and quantitative methods like data analysis, social network analysis, and digital visualizations to study the humanities and reveal new historical or literary insights. And so, in my opinion, digital humanities research is strongest when it really combines both these new quantitative methods as well as the traditional qualitative methods to complement one another. So it's not a replacement for the more traditional modes of humanistic inquiry, but really it's a new avenue to look at questions that we care about and hopefully both confirm kind of established scholarly insights and then also shed new light on these topics.
Wonderful. And this is such interesting work and such an innovative approach. And I'm fascinated by I'm curious to see what technology continues to bring, because I think that, we tend to focus a little too much on the negative things about technology, and there are several, but there's also this, the beauty of what the technology gives us, what it gives you as a scholar, what it gives our students, and how you can have these incredibly important ways of, these, that the technology gives us this a new lens to look at things. And who knows what things. I think it's something I think I was mentioning earlier, that maybe I'm too future centered. I don't know if this is something you feel as well, but when I said it before, I also, like, I find myself thinking a lot about, well, I wonder what things are going to look like in 5 years, right? Because it's been so quick. And I almost, like, sometimes I'll think, well, could this get, like, how will this change? How will this look 2 years from now? How will this look 5 years from now? So it's really exciting. And we would have to come, you have to come back, and we'll talk about AI, and we'll talk about a whole, I think you should just come back to Florence. Okay, so this is my, here, I'm just gonna go with it. So just come to Florence. I don't worry, I have room for you as long as you like big, affectionate dogs. But you come to Florence, you spend some time here, and we do another podcast recording, and we talk about all the stuff that we didn't even get to today. How does that sound?
That sounds wonderful.
Okay. I mean, if I have to, I'll come to Paris. I mean, if you twist my arm, I'll come to San Francisco. I'll come to the Bay Area if I have to. But it's been an absolute pleasure having you. I'm so happy that you came. This is one of the most interesting conversations that I've had, and one of the most thought-provoking. And I am really happy that at least a part of our future is in your hands, that you're teaching tomorrow's leaders, and that you're teaching them these fundamental lessons, and that I want you to know that you definitely are igniting this passion in them for sure, because it's just comes out in every way, through your research, through the way you talk about your teaching, and just the way you are interacting with all these wonderful stories, and the way you're sharing them, and the way you've shared them today. I can't thank you enough. Grazie mille, Chloe. I really loved having you as a guest.
Thank you so much. Grazie a te.
I hope you'll come back. I really do.
Same here.
Ok, grazie mille a tutti e alla prossima volta.